Good afternoon, First Presbyterian Church. My name is Josh Rodriguez, Associate Pastor here, and I am joined here in our broadcast today with the Reverend Dr. Stuart Gordon and the Dr. PhD, what do I say? Dr. Nahed Zehr, and we are here to talk about Malcom Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. We are talking about talking to strangers with some friends here. And we're going to look at Gladwell's big idea of transparency today. Stuart, Nahed, thank you so much for being here in our broadcast today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a good one. As we get going, let me just sort of frame our conversation a little bit, and then we'll take it from there. So Gladwell, in his book, where is it here? I got it on my desk. In his book, he presents two major puzzles at the very beginning. And the questions that he asks are, why can't we identify when a stranger is lying to our face? And what does meeting a stranger face-to-face sometimes why does it make it harder to meet them face-to-face to make sense of that person than it would be if not meeting them at all? And the first answer that we looked at last week was because people default to truth, and that's just understood as human beings default to assuming truth in others. And we talked last week about that. You can check that out. But we sort of landed on, and that's a good thing. You know, we default to truth, and we should. If we didn't, there would be a whole lot more issues. But we do need some holy fools who do not default to truth.
And it's just unavoidable. It's just the way we function. We would have to reprogram ourselves not to function that way.
Yeah, not an endeavor worth taking on. Yeah. And the second thing, and this is what we're about to talk about this week, the second answer to those questions is, because people assume transparency. Stuart, can you kick us off with just a good definition of transparency?
Yeah, when I was growing up in school in the 70s, before computers, teachers would have to, if they wanted to project something, get out something called an overhead projector, and they would have these clear plastic sheets, and they would write on the clear plastic sheet, and it would be projected onto the screen. And the clear plastic screen was called a transparency.
You are 100% right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's what Malcom Gladwell totally meant by.
Ooh, maybe Nahed ought to tell you what transparency is then.
I
seem not to know.
Tell me about Gladwell's understanding of transparency.
So I remember those too, especially in math class, having those transparencies. I think so. From my reading of what Malcom Gladwell is trying to talk about in that particular section in the book, I think he talks about this idea that we believe that people's inner state matches their outer state, and beyond that when we can understand someone's inner state by looking at what's going on the outside. So it's this idea that if I meet somebody, and even if I don't know them, I have this belief that because of the way they're reacting to something that I'm saying, or because of the way that they're expressing themselves, that whatever is happening on the outside is a book or an entryway into what's happening on the inside. And that turns out to not be the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. Nahed, when you read that part of the book, did you read or listen? It was fun to listen to it because he narrated it. Did you read or listen?
I read.
Okay. So when you read that part of the book, how did that hit you a little bit? What was going on with you when you heard that?
Well, I'm somebody that, I guess I thought that I was pretty cued into these subtleties, right, of people's feelings and emotions. And so I guess I just thought a lot about whether that was just a really silly assumption. One thing that, as I kept reading, what he talked about was that, when you get to know somebody, that turns out to actually be much more likely that you're able to understand their inner state from what's going on the outside. Like, I think a lot about my children and of course I'm their mother. It's a very unique and connected relationship, but how I'm often able to tell their emotional state from very subtle things that are happening in their face and their body and the way their voice, the inflection, that sort of thing. But that's not true when it comes to strangers. So I guess the question I really had in my mind is, wow, that's a really big opportunity to pause and think about any kind of interaction that I'm having with a stranger, whether it's one that doesn't really feel that important or significant, something very transactional, or whether, the first time that I'm meeting somebody, I'm making all kinds of assumptions about them that really are unlikely to be true.
Yeah.
So I thought a lot about that and really wanted to try to practice it a little bit.
Yeah. So Stuart, kind of the same question to you. When you interacted with his understanding of transparency, what were some of your initial thoughts on that?
Well, I'll have to get really, I guess, biographical about it. The Amanda Knox chapter was especially impactful for me. Amanda Knox is the young American woman who was living in Italy and was arrested, charged, and jailed for a long time for a murder that she did not commit. And as Gladwell unpacks the investigation, he essentially says that the investigators ignored evidence and went completely with their gut instincts about her facial expressions, her body language, and they just projected onto her an awful lot of assumptions that just had no basis in fact. And the poor woman underwent a horrible ordeal for years and ultimately was exonerated because there was just hardly any evidence whatsoever to convict her. I identified with that because I'm aware of a situation in where I live and the people with whom I work of someone who I think acts like Amanda Knox did. Someone who is unusual, whose facial expressions, whose manner of speech does not accord with people's expectations for what it should be, and therefore is assumed to be guilty in a particular way. And it's an assumption. And so it really hit me how practically influential this is in lives. And it's not so monumental as it was in the case of Amanda Knox, but I think the story gets told over and over and over again. And I guess that's why it's in the book when it comes to talking to strangers and Sandra Bland, when we come back to her at the end of the book, how we can assume way too much about the people we see based on what we think would be a normal facial expression, a normal way of speech. And we just have to appreciate not everybody responds in the same way. And we can't assume that what we're reading is actually what's going on inside a person.
Yeah. And this is funny and kind of what you were getting at, Nahed and Stuart, it has been since reading this part of his book, I listened to it, since listening to this. And when I'm interacting with a stranger, there are several moments when I think I'm trying to read them. And then I have to remember you don't know whether you're reading them right or not. Yeah. And it is a moment of pause to just realize I need to put that at the forefront of my thoughts so that I don't start making judgments and assumptions that, this person's not as friendly as I thought they would be. Or, this person's being way too friendly. Why are they, what's going on here? To just sort of stop and say, I don't know. Stuart, you were trying to, what's the phrase? He talks about the facial recognition. Can you speak a little bit about that
system that they came up with at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth?
Fascinating.
Forgive me for rustling my papers on TV. Now I can't find my papers. So I can't give you the answer, Josh.
Oh,
yes, now I can. It's the Facial Action Coding System, FACS, at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. 43 muscles in the face and all the combinations thereof, whereby they have coded, which is what all doctoral students do, right, Nahed? You come up with a coding system for what you're studying, and so they've coded every facial expression, and then they have people, and computers apparently do this better now, read every facial expression to try to say what it is. And the assumption is that you can always guess what people are feeling. I saw this on 60 Minutes just Sunday evening. With the ability, so there is this confidence, and they might argue with Malcom Gladwell about one's ability to read one's internal state by the external state. Yeah.
Nahed, when you read that little part of it, how did that part stick out to you about the facial recognition?
Kind of creepy.
Yeah.
I just thinking, wow. I tend to resist, and maybe not always correctly, but the types of things that try to like classify people into easily understandable boxes, because I just find people to be so complicated. I think those things can be a start and can provide a lot of insight. Like I think about like the Enneagram, like insight, but I don't think that something like that can capture a person completely. And so it just felt strange to me to think that, that somebody could be so confident in the system. Now, I have not looked at the research. So perhaps if I had, I would feel much more inclined to support this idea, but it just felt funny to think that, wow, somebody's internal state, which is so complicated anyway, and layered and multidimensional, and oftentimes like there's unconscious things that are happening when we're feeling an emotion, can just be identified in this way. But I also tend to be kind of a skeptic. Sometimes,
a holy fool.
No, I do default to truth. And I think, and that has, I think that is a good thing, because it helps us form these systems and relationships that we need to be able to just survive and be connected to each other. We're made for connection.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because when I was reading that, I was also thinking, wow, there have been several times in my life, like in the last few years, where I have so misidentified a person. And even though, like, I guess what I would call red flags have continued to rise to the surface in very clear ways, I just tended to continue to default to this idea of wanting the person to be who I thought they were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And sorry, Nahed, you mentioned the Enneagram, and the Enneagram has been really helpful for me personally, but I'll say most people who handle the Enneagram well will tell you, just because you know someone's number, just because you're familiar with this, you do not know a person.
Yes.
They are endlessly more complicated than this. This is simply a tool in the tool belt. No tool is perfect, but this one can be used. And I'll also say in that regard, identifying just how complicated human beings are, because we're like, it's always a funny thing, but when I think about the fact that I'm complicated, which sometimes I am in certain situations, and I think it's hard for me to identify what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking. And even sometimes when I do land on, okay, this is what I think about this, there's still 3 other voices that are active in my head of, this is why you're wrong, this is why you haven't sat with this long enough, and this is why you think this. It's only bias that's led you to this, Josh. And that's just me. But sometimes my sense is when I look at someone else, I think, oh, I got you. I know, all I needed to do is see these 3 things about you. Gotcha. I didn't, you're not complicated at all. You're easy. I got it.
I would find that so often with my students, just teaching religious studies at a public institution of higher learning. It was so interesting how when it would turn into something internal, like they would receive that so different than when we were talking about somebody else's religion. I don't know. It's just interesting. I do think we have this tendency to, it's almost like we assume that we're complicated, but we don't allow that same liberty to other people very often.
Yeah, it's not a compassion we often extend to others.
Yeah.
Josh, may I introduce my big idea for today?
At
this point,
absolutely.
C.S. Lewis has that wonderful line about the love commandment, in which he says, when you think about it, you're called to love your neighbor as yourself. And one way you love yourself is you give yourself grace. You understand that your behavior, your actions are complicated, that you don't necessarily have evil intent. But you extend that grace to yourself, and you don't do that with other people. You don't love your neighbors yourself. You see an action, a behavior, and you judge. You don't think about what influences, what harms, what fears, what wounds are there. And so for me, the invitation biblically, in our Christian life is to love our neighbor as ourself in understanding that there's way more going on inside a person. Walk a mile in their shoes and you'll understand a little more about what's going on.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know. Nahed, when you hear that, what comes up for you?
I haven't gotten to the lessons part of the book yet, which is immediately after the transparency piece, but I'm assuming it goes back to the initial encounter that the book started with between the woman and the police officer.
Yeah, Sandra Bland and
say that again.
Ryan and Cinia.
Yeah, Sandra Bland and Ryan and Cinia.
And so that's really where, since the book started there, and I would love to be able to get more insight on that puzzle. I keep thinking about how it's going to go back to this piece, but I think what Stuart was saying, I think that holds so much truth. I mean, I think especially as Christians, we have the tremendous responsibility that we have been given as people who follow Jesus, and that's to love others and to love them in remarkable ways. And I cannot imagine a better tool for that than the types of things that this book is discussing in terms of not making assumptions, asking for clarification when we are unsure about what is going on, assuming positive intent in another person in the same way that we would for ourselves, and just assuming that we don't know everything or even very much that there is to know about another person before we start kind of categorizing them into somebody who's like us or somebody who's not like us. So,
yeah. My sense is sometimes that categorization for me, when I notice myself doing it, it's almost a way of simplifying another human being and making it easier to digest who they are or what it is they're saying. And there have been so many situations where I've had to tell someone to their face or tell another person, I totally pegged that person wrong. I thought I knew who they were, and they have totally not fit the box that I had put them in. And every time that happened, it's almost like you would learn, or I would learn. It's almost like I would learn from this. But I still notice myself doing it because this idea of transparency just sits in us. We think we're more confident about what we're capable of than we realize, which is unfortunate.
Like what you're saying, I feel like we meet a person and we're immediately trying to categorize them. And I don't know why we do that, but I know we all do, right? And I wonder if this is an opportunity to say, well, I can't do this very well, so I'm not going to try to categorize you. It's probably kind of counterproductive. I'm just going to try to get to know you. I'm going to assume that I don't know you based on what you look like or what you have said. And I'm just going to take a minute to get to know you. Several of my very best girlfriends have, as they've gotten to know me, told me that I don't make a very good first impression. And so I'm so grateful that, that they didn't just sort of stop with one encounter.
Yeah.
And may I suggest something here, Josh?
Go for it. Yeah.
It's in response to what you're saying here. It's another book I read last year, the How to Think book by Alan Jacobs at Baylor. He is surveying some other books and talks about first order thinking and second order thinking. I think it's similar to the default to truth. Our brains simply cannot function on 16 cylinders all the time. So we have first order thinking in which we make assumptions. For instance, if you're walking through a park and you see an old woman sitting on a bench and she asks you to come over, you have no fear, no hesitation. You go over because old woman does not seem threatening to you.
Yeah.
But if it's someone who's in a group different from you and you have certain impressions of that group that are negative, you're going to stop and think about it. And that's bias that is unavoidable. We all have fundamental biases that you can never extinguish from yourself. The challenge of thinking is to go to second level thinking in which you can consider your biases and test them to see if they're right. It would be impossible for us to do second order thinking all the time. We simply don't have the rapid access memory to do that all the time. So that book is an invitation for us to think. It's an invitation for us to enter into certain practices, habits of thinking that help get past our biases.
Yeah. And Stuart, that makes me wonder if there's not an opportunity, thinking about as a Christian, to sort of go off of what you said, Nahed, of like the idea of offering our curiosities to another human being. Because there are moments we can't do that second level thinking all the time,
Right.
but we can do it sometimes.
Right.
And the grace of being curious about another human being in conversation. I told someone the other week, I don't remember what the context was, but I said, if you're bored talking to the person who's in front of you, just try asking them about themselves. Just start asking them, where'd you grow up? Well, or I think I said, just ask them about their relationship with their father. Inevitably, if you offer someone the grace of a curiosity, you will stumble upon far more depth to a human being than typically what we get at just an initial reaction or just whatever our biases are. And I wonder if practicing something like that when it's not, I don't know, maybe the heat of the moment or wherever it may be, could sort of adjust our posture or maybe redeem our posture for those other situations.
Well, I know that it does. And I know that the more you practice it, the more it becomes, I don't want to say habit, because I think it's something you have to practice all the time, but the easier it becomes. I mean, you know, Josh and Stuart, you all know about my history with Faith and Culture Center and the work that we did to try to help Nashvillians get to know their Muslim neighbors. And that was basically what we would do in a city at the table. We would create an environment that would allow for that. An environment that gives somebody an opportunity to pause, reset, check assumptions, and just have a conversation with another person and learn more about them to try to provide responses to these pernicious stereotypes that exist of Muslims in our community. And it's very effective. It's incredibly effective. And I think that once you have an encounter like that, you tend to want more encounters like that. And I think you tend to be able to take something that, you know, happens very, very rarely and bring it into your life in such a way that it can happen more often. And with other types of people, you know, I think so much about work where you're trying to align and bring people together towards a common objective, and how often we assume what people are thinking or what they're going to say or how they're going to react. And we make assumptions about their internal state about something based on a simple reaction sometimes to an idea, and how often we're wrong. Mm-hmm. So how, you know, I think about how much more relationship building can happen if we're able to try to more often move to that second order of thinking that Stuart is talking about, to try to just make that something that happens more often in our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuart, I'm going to ask you to explain some of the book, because let's complicate this a little bit.
Oh, that's fine.
Let's complicate our conversation by throwing alcohol into the conversation. Because in this section of the book, Gladwell looks at the, well, Stuart, go ahead. Introduce the situation that Gladwell complicates the whole conversation with when he starts to look at alcohol.
Yeah, this is one of the more difficult chapters in the book to read. It deals with alcohol and sexual violence on college campuses. And Gladwell tries to investigate, you know, certain assumptions about what alcohol does to a human being's judgment, and challenges, and then offers an alternative to what it is that alcohol actually, you know, some people assume that alcohol brings out a person's true personality. And so when a person drinks enough, the real person comes out. And he dispels that myth. He said it basically makes you myopic, that the influence of alcohol makes you think about only what's right in front of you rather than long-term consequences.
And can I just say that was, I had not considered it that way. And the way that I have heard it in my life plenty of times is when someone drinks, the real person comes out in them. That's how I've always thought about that. I don't know, Nahed, if that is how you have thought about alcohol, but that's certainly when he said that, I'm like, that's how I've always thought about it by default. I didn't think I was making a choice. I thought we just all knew that.
No, I don't think I have. I wonder if it's the difference between, I don't know, like a female's perspective on it and a male's perspective on it. I mean, that was a very hard chapter to read. So Jane Doe that he talks about in that chapter, I read her memoir. She eventually published a book about that experiences and about the court case. And I read it before, like maybe 6 months ago. And her description of what happened is different, and which we can talk about later. But I've never thought about the fact that the real person comes out. What I've always thought about is that it just kind of lowers people's inhibitions. It lowers people's ability to make good decisions.
Yeah.
I would not say that I think it makes somebody's true personality comes out. I think sometimes it's, especially once it gets to the point where somebody is drunk, not just having a good time. Like most of the time, I'm not sure how you would even describe a personality of a drunk person. They're just not in control of themselves or their faculties, if that makes sense.
It was like the guy we ran into at Centennial Park on Monday. Ann and I were out for Labor Day, and we found a nice quiet spot next to the lake under some trees. And a couple joins us on the other side of a grove, and they're playing Mozart. And I thought, well, if you're going to be playing music publicly, I'm happy for you to be playing Mozart. I'm okay with that. But then the guy walks over, and he's drunk. You can tell by the way he's talking, he's just drunk. And he starts up a conversation with us, and he just wants to be engaged. And I'm trying to be friendly, and hoping he'll go away. But he stays, and he keeps talking. And so clearly he had lost his inhibitions. I don't know what else was going on there. But, when it comes to the chapter in the book, and for me, I was grateful for Malcom Gladwell using this, because it's been something that's long troubled me about the situation on college campuses. I'm glad I don't have a daughter. I mean, my wife works on a college campus. She knows, well what goes on college campuses. There is so much sexual violence on college campuses. It's a scandal that the country doesn't even know about. We don't know the 10th of the sexual violence that goes on college campuses.
It's terrifying.
And alcohol is the number one factor. And it boggles my mind that the whole American university system can just cover its eyes and ears to this rampant problem. He suggests you take alcohol out of the mix and you're going to deal with the problem.
Mm-hmm.
At least a good percentage of it.
Yeah. And so maybe to explain a little bit more for someone who hadn't read the book, when he talks about the myopia theory, is it myopia theory? It's essentially what, Stuart, you kind of already said, is that when someone starts drinking, it becomes the number one thing that they desire is just the thing that's in front of them. And so you're not necessarily getting the true person. You're just getting a person that is interacting in a way that whatever's right in front of me that seems desirable, that's my primary focus. And then he addresses the situation of taking college students he sort of describes a fraternity party where there's a lot of, provocative dancing happening, is very loud. The lights are low. You can't hardly see. People have far over consumed alcohol. And you put them in that situation, amongst other things, you put them in that situation where it's just sort of a pressure cooker. And then you see, okay, let's see what their desires are going to be. Mm. Well, inevitably, sexual desires come about. And then the situation that he plays out, and this is in no way, I want to be really careful here. I'm not trying to set the stage, and I don't think Gladwell did either, and I think he handled it okay, to say that somehow Jane Doe was at fault for being, he was not blaming her or in no way excusing, I can't recall his name right now, excusing the actions of the
man in this.
The man in this. What was it?
The perpetrator.
Yeah, the perpetrator. In no way excusing his actions, but just looking at, if you put those actions in this context and then sort of watch them unfold, it's just a horrendous scene, and horrendous things happen over and over again. So
I appreciated what he was trying to say and to point out. I agree that when copious amounts of alcohol are consumed and somebody has totally lost control of their faculties, like it's much easier to be put into a dangerous situation. What I think is not being captured in his presentation of this is when he says, okay, you become myopic and you just want the thing that is in front of you. What's really happening is that the person ceases to see that other person as a human being with a body that does not belong to anyone but them.
Yeah.
Is willing to sacrifice or use that person as a means to an end. And I think it's really important to say that it isn't just this person sees something that they desire and they go after it. They see something that they desire and they're willing to treat the other person as non-human in order to get it.
And they read the other person wrongly. I mean, this is the context for it is they read clues wrongly. And so he's got that chart in there that was completed in a survey of college students. Does this step equate with this? Does a kiss mean the other person wants sex? Does taking clothes off mean? And men and women are in completely different places in the aggregate on what they perceive is being communicated by the other by each of these actions. And
is that to me sort of, there's like this whole thing. It just kind of goes back to these ideas that I went to college. I kind of know, like I know this environment.
Yeah, we've been there.
Yep.
And I just, there is an environment of almost like this idea that women are prey and that the objective, and this is not, please don't think that I'm saying this is true of all men. I'm not saying that. But there's this idea that like, this is what happens when you go to college, like the hookup culture, sometimes it's referred to. I don't know if it's still referred to as that. I mean, it's been a long time since I've been to college, but this idea that this is like what happens, that men try to pursue women and they try to get these women to, engage in sexual acts, and that it's some kind of like pursuit rather than thinking of this is the person who's standing in front of me who has the same sorts of rights to their body as I do. And the point here is not to prey upon another person. So I understand what Malcom Gladwell is saying about the role of alcohol. I just think it is one factor in a much more complicated situation.
Yeah. I would agree. I would add that I think you can do all the educating in the world as a university to teach young men what you just said, and alcohol will cancel it in an hour. And so I don't have a lot of confidence that universities could educate young men out of sexual predation.
Well, I think that's something that needs to happen at home.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
I don't know that.
I'll say myself, I grew up in a Christian home, went to college, joined a fraternity, witnessed all that, and am of the opinion that we're shaped by our immediate culture.
Yes.
And St. Augustine in his Confessions talks about the things that he would do in front of his friends just because he didn't want to be seen as, not part of the gang. And we'll read Glittering Vices as the Community of Belonging book, and it'll make reference to Augustine. And so I don't have a lot of confidence that within that bubble, which is the party scene on a college campus, that moral formation is a vaccine against alcohol.
You mean moral formation at home?
At home, educational formation at the university. I think the university's representatives can talk until they're blue in the face. But you put 6,000 college students on a campus and you mix in alcohol, and you should expect carnage.
Yeah, I will admit. So I went to a Christian liberal arts school in Indiana, a small one, and there was no drinking culture. You signed something that when you went there, you would not drink. You were not allowed to drink, and you were covenanting not to until you graduated. So throughout summers, throughout breaks, this was something that you had bound yourself to the whole time you were enrolled as a student. And I've gone back and forth on how I feel about an institution asking that of a student, especially in a Christian setting, and the sort of righteousness and a lot of the distortions that can come from it. But when I finished this chapter, I remember thinking, I feel more grateful now than I used to. I feel more grateful that an institution, I hear what you're saying, Stuart, that we can't, it's almost, it's a pretty lofty goal to expect an institution to be able to fix this with a policy or two or an educational handling of it. But at the end of the day, hi Nadine, or Nora, sorry. At the end of the day, I felt really grateful that was not a factor. And there are so many situations that I was probably saved from in social circles because it just wasn't there. There wasn't a culture of it. And the students who went there took that covenant pretty seriously. There were certainly people who still drank, but there was not a culture of, if you went to hang out on a Friday night at someone's dorm room, or if you were to walk in and see alcohol, I never had that happen to me. When I went to go hang out with people on a Friday night at my university, alcohol, the assumption was it would not be there. Mm-hmm. And if you ever saw that it was, this can get pretty complicated, but it was almost like you don't take your faith very seriously because the covenant that you signed said you wouldn't be doing this. And again, not that somehow I'm holier than thou because I didn't. I guess I can say it now. I drank while I was there, not before I was 21, but the situations were few and far between. And it was never the situation that Gladwell describes. I've never been in the situation of walking into a fraternity party where I have been drinking copious amounts of alcohol. Everyone has. And we sort of say, hey, let's see what unfolds. Let's see what our desires might be right now. I've never been in that situation. So
don't go there now. No,
yeah, I don't think I need to go there now.
No need.
Okay, so we need to wrap this up a little bit. Let's ask our final question here. When we think about Malcom Gladwell and his understandings, oh man, we didn't ask the police tactics question. Well, we'll get there. When we think about this understanding of transparency, and that maybe we are not as good at understanding strangers as we think we are, how does that inform our faith as Christians? How does that play out for us as people who are trying to faithfully follow Jesus?
You want to go first or second, Nahed?
I'll go. I'm scared to go second.
Go first. Never follow Stuart Gordon.
Well, you answered the first question first, and it was awesome, so I didn't have to answer it. I'm hoping it happens again.
I guess, well, you can take a stab at it, I guess. I just think, to me, it was a reminder to check myself, mm-hmm. and to not assume that I know what people are thinking or feeling, especially strangers, and an invitation to extend the same type of generosity that I would want somebody to extend to me to another person. And I think this comes out especially with people who think differently than me about certain things, have different values than I do. There's a lot of sort of value, moral driven rhetoric right now. Mm-hmm. And I think it serves as an opportunity to really pause and investigate the way that I assume things about other people, mm-hmm. and to remember that's not what's been asked of me.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuart, what would you offer?
Mine would be similar to that. And it may not be directly from this chapter, but it's what's on my mind these days. It has to do with the ease with which we can see negative behavior in other people and utilize that as justification for dismissing them, judging them, writing them off. And I have been especially sensitized lately to an appreciation for whenever, I see it in myself and I assume it in other people. Whenever I'm engaging in behavior that's less than what I want to be, usually there's a good reason for it. It's not because I intentionally sat down and thought, I'm going to be a jerk about this. No, we all carry around inside of us histories, wounds, disappointments, things that scar us. And so whenever I come across someone who seems especially angry, or someone who's rude, or someone who's bigoted, I try to be compassionate. And while holding up my disagreement with a particular negative behavior, suspending judgment and remembering that the Christian faith has an offer of redemption, because that's the way God deals with us.
Mhm.
God confronts us in our unrighteous behavior, but understands it to be a consequence of sin. This whole complicated web of influences in the world that enslave us and have us behaving in ways that do damage to ourselves in addition to others. And so I'm trying to remember to even see negative behaviors, destructive behaviors compassionately, and to lean in rather than dismissing and writing off.
Stuart, what you're saying is reminding me of something. Like, we're talking a lot about strangers or people we don't know, but this holds true even for our most intimate relationships. Joel and I were reading this book called Hold Me Tight. And it's a book that's based on it's called something
It's
like
emotionally focused therapy.
Emotionally focused therapy. Thank you.
Great book.
It is such a great book. And it talks a lot about how so many of the fights or the disagreements, especially the big ones that we have with our most intimate relationships with our husbands and our wives are things that trigger these like scars in us. And that so often we're making assumptions about why a person is reacting or saying something that are completely wrong. Like, they're and so reading that book I think sort of demonstrates like how this is really true, even with the people that we know the most and who know us the most.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add, thinking about this as a Christian, to all of this is just the amount of humility that is needed to actually faithfully follow Jesus. And interacting with, and I kind of brought it up last time we spoke, but again, it just keeps coming forward. The eyes and the compassion that must be extended to individuals if we're going to interact, if we're going to love our neighbor well, if we're going to love our neighbor that we know really well, but especially if we're going to love our neighbor that we don't know very well, there's got to be a certain amount of humility that we as Christians take on. And if we must be confident, the only thing you should be confident in is that you must be humble to do this, because there are so many damaging things that we can do in just assuming we understand another human being. And that, I don't know, perhaps a holy curiosity is something that we should just try to curate in ourselves when we interact with people. Just be wholly curious and be willing to try to curate a posture in the world that doesn't assume, well, they did this, so I'm going to think this about them. And if we notice it, right? If you do that, notice it and name it. So
I don't want to make sweeping generalizations here, so I'm just going to keep the statement to me. But I have found that as my faith deepens, as I draw closer to God, my humility increases. It's one of those things. It's like, when I went to graduate school, what happened was that I learned, like, the more I know, the more I realize how much I don't know. Like, every time I acquire like some level of increased knowledge or expertise on a subject, I realize like the vast amount of research and literature that I have yet to even tap into. And that's very much been the case in terms of my my faith. The more it grows, the less I feel like the more humble and the more I become, and the more humility I express, because I realize, like, I mean, the ability to know God's mind and heart that's not accessible to me. And it's necessary to allow God into something. You have to be willing to open door and say, God, I don't know what to do at all here, so come and help me. It just takes so much humility. And I think that grows right alongside our faith.
Yeah. Amen. I think that's a perfect place to stop. Nahed, thank you so much for joining us here on this conversation. This is part 2 of a 4-part series. Stuart Gordon and I will be back here next Thursday at the noon o'clock hour with another guest that I'm sure my email is familiar with who it is, but I do not know yet. But Nahed, thank you so much for being here with Stuart and I today. We appreciate you.
Yes, honored that you asked.
Yes.
You're the best, Nahed.
Absolutely. All right. And thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in and watching. Please feel free to give us questions, comments, concerns, or tacky gestures And we'll just keep trying to faithfully fumble forward and following Jesus. Amen.
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 All right. Take care, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.